only two there are still only two big areas where change in regulation has been signalled or is happening, and that's freedom of movement, citizen rights, as I mentioned, on the one hand, and agriculture on the other. In lots of other areas, and we have to be really vigilant here and see what happens, there isn't at the moment a lot of change in the substance of the regulation. Um, in these areas, Brexit as a project is really, if you like, about empty symbols and the formal transfer of regulatory powers to the UK without actually changing, at the moment, many of those rules. A really important case for us to keep an eye on here is what happens with the Environmental Protection Agency. The UK, as anyone who lives in one of our big cities knows, unfortunately, was a big breaker of EU environmental rules. And we tended to lose quite a few cases in this area at the European Court of Justice. And that means that the new regulatory agency that the government has created, the Environmental Protection Agency, we have to keep a really close eye on it, because we need to ask, well, is it going to do, and is it doing as good a job as the old European agency that no longer has regulatory authority in the UK? So will they be genuinely independent of the government? Will they be a tough regulator? You know, those are the questions that we're going to need to keep asking and looking at as this Brexit process comes through, and not least because, as I suspect many people in this event tonight will know, environmental regulation is an area where a huge amount of our laws came from the EU, and they've now been moved over to the UK statute book. Another really important thing to keep an eye on, and this has been in the news recently, is all those trade deals the government wants to sign overseas. And this is very much an area where you see the contradictions between SW1, Parliament, Brexiteers, and the base of the Brexiteers. And that's an opportunity for us as a campaign. The American one, thankfully, doesn't look at the moment like it's on the cards. The change in US administration and Biden's victory over Trump that we're all so happy about is the big change in the whole situation that has meant that the deal probably isn't on the table anymore. But of course, our friends at Global Justice Now were also really successful at toxifying that agreement in the UK public debate by pointing out that we didn't want to have hormone cured beef, we didn't want to have chlorine chicken, we wanted to maintain our existing environmental standards. And we have to apply this same kind of energy and approach to the other agreements coming up to break the Brexit coalition. The Daily Mail, for example, was against the US trade deal. It's also written pieces against the Australia deal as well because of its impact on UK farmers. And this really, I think, cuts to the heart of some of the contradictions of Brexit. What's it really about? Who's it for? And what's the game plan that the government has in store in implementing this agenda? And really, I think, as you've seen over the last few days in relation to COVID-19 and the government via chaos line, Boris Johnson as a prime minister has a real tendency to muddle through. Look at how he responded to Marcus Rashford's campaign last year for free school meals as well, not taking a clear position, implying you support something, being incredibly opportunistic with public opinion and not saying what you really think about things. Now, that's almost a modus operandi for this government. But I think in their general opportunism, that does mean that we can win demands over Brexit definitely in some areas if we're really successful at toxifying some of these issues amongst their supporters. And you can imagine that happening with environmental regulations. You can imagine that happening with farming and agriculture and trade deal issues in the years ahead. So we have to be really strong on campaigning on these issues. Another Europe, as will probably come up in the discussion, we're in principle in favour of rejoining the EU. We think that's still the best deal on the table, but we recognise that that's not very easy in the short term, not least because you would have to get over the obstacles not only in British politics, but on the European side, where unanimous consent of existing EU member states would be required. But we're determined and adamant that a better, high regulation, pro citizen rights trade deal is possible and can be popular. Look at the businesses and workers in export industries that have a huge incentive to get a better deal with Europe. You've seen that very much in the huge collapse in trade, EU trade in the first half of the year. And many of these effects, whether they are economic, but also cultural, things like citizen rights on the mobility side, have been hidden by COVID-19. It's just such a huge crisis. It's taken over everything. But as we gradually come out of the pandemic, as people start having foreign holidays again and getting used to the significant restrictions on their movement that exists, I think there will be more scope to say that the current arrangements simply aren't good enough and have got to change. So we have to call for this. We have to campaign for this. I think it's the right approach to take. And I think, for all the reasons that we outline in this report, a better deal is possible. There's a clear alternative based on high standards, high investment, open immigration, cooperation with Europe and our global partners to deliver a sustainable and democratic politics that we need.
Thank you very much, Luke, for this overview and for touching on kind of the most important issues identified in the report, but overall issues that we've been campaigning on from the beginning, really. And Caroline has been one of our co-founders, staunchest supporters, and a complete ally on all these problems we've identified and that we're living through now. Caroline, can you share with us your insights based on what Luke has discussed, but also the way it looks from inside Parliament at the moment?
Thanks so much, Elena. I'm really delighted to join you for this launch and to discuss this new report, and many congratulations to Luke on its publication and indeed on the new Spotlight website, which I think is an excellent thing. Thank you to AEIP for inviting me, and thank you also for keeping alive the reality that there is an alternative to accepting the government's Brexit deal, and in their words, moving on, but continuing to express how that deal could be better in so many ways is not just possible, it's urgent and essential. And as this report makes crystal clear, that looking again at the terms of the deal is, according to recent polls, actually following the famous will of the people. So before I go into the kind of changes I think we should be advocating, let me say this, that to surrender to the idea that the PM's Brexit deal is set forever in stone isn't moving on, that isn't bringing the country back together. It's essentially, I think, cowardice. It's a dereliction of duty. It's a failure of vision and of opposition. It's abandoning hope, and hope is the currency which fuels change. And all those who want a safer, fairer, greener future, whether they voted Leave or Remain, whether they're from town or countryside in the referendum, I think it's failing them as well. So the government's deal gave the green light to cutting British jobs, to sidelining our services sector, and to undermining hard-won protections for the environment, for workers' rights, and for consumers. It condemns us to live in a poorer, more unequal, and more isolated Britain. It leaves us less equipped to rise to the greatest challenges that we face, the nature and climate emergencies. And nor did it ever have the explicit informed consent of the British people. If you consider yourself progressive or a socialist or a Democrat, an environmentalist, an internationalist, I don't think you should be staying silent about the consequences of this deal and about the endless ways that it could and should be improved, about what the route to a better relationship with Europe might look like. I think this moment in our history demands we all use our voices, and it demands an internationalist and cooperative Britain playing a progressive and leading role on the global stage, world leading rather than world beating. Because from the climate emergency to the refugee crisis, from keeping fossil fuels in the ground to transforming democracy for the 21st century, Britain does have an opportunity to redefine global leadership and to ensure that post-Brexit, we're engaged in building bridges and alliances rather than retreating into a backward-looking nostalgia. And I think the bridges and the alliances that we should prioritise building are those that connect us with our closest allies and neighbours in Europe. So as the report argues, this will take active re-engagement. And when it comes to our trading relationship in particular, I think there is overwhelming public support for that. Now, it's clear we won't simply be able to pick up where we left off. We've done a lot of damage, and our reputation, understandably, given the Prime Minister's behaviour, is in tatters. So for those of us who continue to advocate the closest possible relationship with the EU, I think we must start relatively small in what we ask for and big in what we offer. We need to offer friendship that's defined by hope and courage and, crucially, humility as a country and as individual citizens. That's how we begin to heal the hurt that's been caused by Brexit, the length and breadth of the UK and right across Europe. And that's how we start to build trust again, I think, to pave the way for repairing relations and revisiting the terms of the deal. And first of all, perhaps we could begin to make a strong case to our EU neighbours and those in our own communities for rejoining the customs union. The decision to put up new trade barriers with our largest trading partner has had the inevitable consequences that we warned about, with trade falling off a cliff. Figures released in March showed a 40% decline in UK exports to the EU, clear evidence that Boris Johnson's apparent determination to utterly disregard businesses has succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. The deal he signed has created significant structural problems that can't just be dismissed as so-called teething problems, particularly when it comes to agriculture and food. And I'm part of a new body that's been set up in Parliament. You'll recall, I expect, that the Brexit committee that was scrutinising Brexit was disbanded by the government. Hilary Benn, you'll recall, was the chair of that. So in its place, working with Best for Britain, a number of MPs have come together, chaired again by Hilary, alongside a number of businesses, to set up a new commission for trade and business so that we will be scrutinising what is happening with the trade and cooperation agreement. And we had a hearing just this morning, for example, with small businesses, small and medium-sized businesses. And the real damage done by Brexit to them, I think, is one that was made incredibly clear and is one that can't be overlooked. And I'm really glad that we still have in Parliament, sort of, by this new body that's been set up, a way of scrutinising the Brexit deal. And as I say, it's cross-party and has many different kinds of businesses on it as well. And I think that body and the work that we've done shows that it makes complete sense to renegotiate the Brexit deal so British businesses and our economy can benefit from fewer obstacles as goods move across borders. It makes complete sense, unless that is you're Boris Johnson, blinded by your own bluff, bluster and ego, or, sadly, if you're Keir Starmer, hamstrung by your own triangulation. Both the TUC and the CBI were united in arguing that the UK must remain in the customs union after Brexit, and the business case remains compelling. So too does the case when it comes to labour standards, food standards, environmental protection. The deal struck is so much weaker in this respect than ministers bent over backwards to reassure us would be the case. The think tank IPPR has pointed out that whilst in theory there are level playing field safeguards between UK and EU businesses, in practice, the bar for proof is set so high that UK standards could easily be watered down. Combine this with how willing ministers have prostrated themselves to strike trade deals further afield, and it's no wonder that those of us worried about the chlorinated chicken, or indeed of the NHS being put on the table in trade talks, aren't sleeping easy yet. Now, there will be challenges, of course there will. Trust has been hugely badly damaged, so getting the EU to consider such a move in good faith will not be straightforward. But that's not a reason not to set it as an objective. And if the last year or so has taught us anything, it's that all manner of things are possible when the right political will is there. So honouring the sensitivities about borders between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland and the rest of the UK is also obviously going to be key as we explore how to forge closer ties again. We cannot hang peace out to dry, as Boris Johnson was prepared to do. So I think there's an opportunity for re-engagement there too, a chance to demonstrate the proof of concept, if you like, in relation to cooperation for mutual interest. So a UK-EU veterinary agreement would go some considerable way to resolving major barriers for UK food exporters and the volume of checks required for implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Such an agreement would establish sanitary and phytosanitary rules on the movements of animals and food between GB and the EU and between GB and Northern Ireland. Erasmus is another obvious contender for collaboration that benefits everyone. No amount of spin and lies can conceal the sheer bloody mindedness of the government's refusal to protect the right to live and study abroad. Erasmus fosters precisely understanding across borders and cultures, laying the foundation for sustained cooperation. So let's not be afraid to demand future generations be gifted with that opportunity. And let's also recognise that the political rifts with our EU neighbours may well heal more readily if we can continue to nurture the bonds that otherwise unite us. Now, this report envisages a range of other steps along the way to restoring a close and progressive relationship with Europe. A mutual rights agreement for UK and EU citizens to reinstate free movement, for example. And in the meantime, there is no justification for not guaranteeing settled status to EU citizens and their family members living in the UK, and guaranteeing full rights to every one of the so-called 3 million. And frankly, recent stories of EU citizens arriving in the UK and being held in detention centres and then expelled was beyond shameful. This was despite many of those EU nationals having job interviews, despite the fact that the rules do allow non-visa holders to attend those interviews. Somehow we locked up our closest neighbours and then sent them back. So an open conversation with our friends about our relationship with Europe mustn't be afraid to celebrate how EU citizens, our friends, families, lovers and work colleagues have enriched our life. And so let's not be afraid to make that case still for free movement, or indeed, finally, to learn the lessons of the past. As we've always said, the EU was forged out of the rubble of the Second World War. And as we emerge from the COVID pandemic and face the growing threats posed by a rising tide of populism, then being able to offer a positive and progressive route to security, as opposed to one reliant on scapegoating and racism, is paramount once again. And of course, we need to tackle head on the myths and misinformation that have been allowed to dictate the Brexit debate. Talking about the EU we want, as much as about the reality of the EU that exists, must also be part of the conversation. There was not enough of that done during the referendum campaign, and we may well be paying the price for that mistake for some time to come. And it's also time to reject the UK-centric approach that's dominated to date. We need to pursue and proudly promote a new agenda for the common good. Brexit was always a profoundly reckless project for our livelihoods and our rights. It was built on the idea that we'd be able to quit the EU and then close the chapter having got Brexit done. As we know, that was a fantasy. And armed with this report, we can not only expose it as such, we have concrete ideas for how to turn the page and start a new story about our future as Europeans. It's going to be a long road, but knowing some of the landmarks along the way certainly bring us many steps closer, and that's a reason to be profoundly hopeful.
Thank you so much, Caroline. Thank you for your kind words and hopeful message as always. And there's a lot that I would like to kind of unpick from that. But first, I'm going to invite Paul now to join the conversation. Paul, first of all, congratulations once again on your recent new role in the Scottish Parliament. I'm very happy you're representing Glasgow personally. And I think your insight would be even more interesting because we're talking now about a kind of a three-way negotiation from the perspective of the Scottish Parliament, the UK government, and the EU, and what that looks like for Scotland as well as the UK. So feel free to take the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Elena. Nice to be representing you in the Scottish Parliament in Glasgow. And I think if you can survive the tumultuous Brexit Parliament of 2017 to 2019, you can survive anything. We've not quite leapt on the Speaker's chair yet,
Yeah, those were the wild years.
Yeah, just actually reflecting on that whole period, it's the tragedy of it all really is the thing that hits home the most. The deception of a very the deception of people's legitimate grievances about a sense of alienation in their lives, a sense that globalization hadn't served their interests, the long decline of deindustrialization, communities that weren't reinvested in, that community wealth was stripped away. All of these things, all these legitimate grievances were grotesquely manipulated by nationalists in the Conservative Party against another, which in this case was the European Union, monstered it and turned it into this kind of malevolent force that was somehow denying or stymieing progress for people, and that erupted, of course, in the referendum, and of course, asking a very complex question and only offering simplistic answers caused all sorts of problems, which we had to grapple with in that parliament about what did leave actually mean. What was it that British people really wanted? I think it's fair to say they wanted agency and they wanted greater democracy. And these are all legitimate demands. But the supreme irony is that the British Parliament has spent the last, well, certainly the Conservative government has basically spent the last 3 years destroying the agency and the sovereignty of the British Parliament, and indeed the wider community of nations in Britain, in the way that they've vandalized so much of our constitution in the process of driving through Brexit in the manner they have done. That is far removed from some of the claims that were made at the time of the referendum. We can go through all of those claims that were made about how it would be soft and it wouldn't threaten our relationship and trade, etc. And now we've seen it, give them an inch and they'll take a mile. And I think that's the truth, that it's been a coup of sorts, a constitutional coup that's been staged by the nationalist interests in the Conservative Party. And the thing that struck me as most ironic is these are people who claim to be unionists or people who believe in the idea of Britain. Yet their actions in the last 5 years or so have done more to damage the integrity of this country than anything that we've ever experienced before in its history. Not least the fact that they were unable to be honest with people about what the reality of Brexit was. I always thought of it as a sort of trilemma, a three-way dilemma, but a trilemma, where you had to put, if they were going to leave the customs union and the single market, there was going to have to be a hard border somewhere. And they would never be honest with people about that reality. You could draw it in 3 places. You could draw it in the English Channel between Dover and Calais. You could draw it in the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Ireland, or you could draw it on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Those were the 3 options. And there's never been any escaping of that reality. And what did they do? They chose to draw it down the Irish Sea. And that's why I've got this ridiculous scenario of the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's appalling what they've done. They've actually rendered the fabric of the country in the way that they've pursued this, threatening the peace process in Northern Ireland and the means of doing it. It's disgusting what they've done. But there is a grounds for hope to build out of this, and I think what Luke has done, this bit of work, is really, really powerful in that sense, that there's raking through the ashes of where we are right now. There's opportunity to build some structure back to this and some sanity back, frankly, into a relationship with Europe. The one thing that they failed to ever recognise was that at the end of the day, the European Union is a rules-based system, and it was their inability to engage with it in a good faith fashion that was always going to end badly for Britain. And they've ill-served the British people in doing that, and have undermined the integrity of the UK, not just in respect of Northern Ireland, but also in terms of Scotland, which emphatically rejected leaving the European Union. But also the promises that were made, even in communities which voted leave in Scotland, such as in the northeast of Scotland, where there's such an importance around the fishing industry. Now we're seeing 40% of all fish landed in Danish ports coming from Scottish fishing boats to try and circumvent the reality of the Brexit imposed customs checks, and the collapse, in fact, of the value of fish landed in British ports now, because they're not able to be rapidly exported through British ports into the European continent. We saw the calamitous situation in the Channel ports at the turn of the year, where we had millions of pounds of product written off because it was rotting inside refrigerated lorries instead of reaching dinner plates in Paris. This is the reality of the destruction, the vandalism that's been caused, and the gaslighting of communities that voted for this in good faith, expecting promises that were made about the interests of these industries, such as fishing, to be upheld, and have been absolutely cruelly deceived by what's went on. And we're seeing this repeated. We saw the trade deal with Australia potentially going to lead to massive dumping of imports in agriculture that would destroy the British farming industry. This is the next phase of the Great Deception. And this all, and it seems to be all couched in the idea that this is somehow standing up for British interests. This is standing up for British industry. This is going to advance British wealth. I just don't see how that's happening. What it is a coup by libertarians, ironically, who want to basically slash and burn Britain's industries and expose them to a one-sided deal that will just lay waste to our domestic production capacity and allow global exports to flood in unfettered. I don't see how that can remotely tally with what the idea of taking back control was. And that just goes back to the root cause of the problem. The construction of this grotesque enemy that was total fantasy in Europe, and using that as a lightning rod for people's frustration. And then actually the very things that they were worried about are now being rammed into their communities and destroying their living standards as a result. And I just think that we've failed to grapple with the enormity of that political economy and actually showing the leadership necessary to turn the debate back to sanity, rather than just capitulating and appeasing this narrative that's seemingly hardwired into people's agenda that Brexit is now done and it has to be it has to just be accepted. It's going to always be an evolving relationship. We have to accept that there's three great rule-making and rule-shaping bodies in the world right now, and it's the United States, the European Union, and China. Unless we're going to be actually constructively engaged with our European partners, we're simply going to become further marginalized as the great massive challenges facing mankind confront us. We're going to be continually marginalized and irrelevant in this discussion. So, so much for standing up for British interests. It's been an exercise in retrenchment and retreat from the world's great problems, the climate emergency, the trade that we need to actually hardwire into Europe to say we need to build relationships that are about decarbonizing global trade flows, actually building wealth and resilience within communities, and reducing that level of carbon intensity across the world. That's the sort of agenda we need to be leading on in the world right now. And we're boldly marching in the opposite direction. It's really tragic what's happened. And I think that what Luke's attempted to achieve with this report is really encouraging, because it shows us a way through which we can build a positive trajectory back again from the kind of stupor we found ourselves in, where we're still reeling from the sort of surreal reality that we found ourselves in, and trying to build a constructive relationship back out of it. We need to have a customs union. We need to have a close and integrated relationship with the single market, one that's based on mutual respect and mutual engagement, one that builds British influence, not surrenders it. These are all things we need to achieve. Anything from withdrawing from the Galileo program to Erasmus, all these things have been destructive. They've damaged British industry, they've damaged British research, and they've damaged the opportunity for our people. And we need to recognise that it's not just gone in the sense that it's damaging our material conditions, it threatens the very integrity of the United Kingdom now, because there's a real tension built up between this kind of English nationalist sentiment, basically the UKipification of the Tory party from within, which is really threatening the integrity of the United Kingdom now. There's no respect, no recognition that Britain is a multipolar democratic polity now. There's no understanding about that looser relationship that has resulted from 20 years of devolution now. And as a result, they're just storing up tensions that might erupt in a really destructive way. We might see the fragmentation of Britain itself if we're not careful, rather than building a more constructive relationship that it secures the future prosperity and integrity of Britain, but also builds that integral relationship with Europe and the wider world. That's something we all want to achieve. And I think Luke's perhaps spelled out elements which we can start to look at to recover that journey, but it has to be rooted in an idea and an analysis and an idea of telling people that what they wanted is best served by this agenda. What they want is community wealth building. What they want is control. What they want is respect for their and dignity for their community and their country. All of that's been damaged by what's happened, and we need to rebuild it. And it's actually recognizing that very objective has to be best served by our agenda. So I think if we can meet people where they're at with that frustration, we can hopefully turn the tide, because rather than just saying, oh, we're too scared to challenge the Brexiteers because it'll mean that we'll be in electoral oblivion, isn't good enough. It's actually a real weak form of leadership. And it's a pretty cynical calculation, actually, and it rather misjudges and sort of underestimates the sort of the British people's ability to sort of look at things with an open mind. And I think we need to get back onto that framework. And I think that what Luke spelled out today is really hopeful for the left in this country, and hopefully it can give us some guidance as how we move forward.
Thanks, Paul. Now I know that both Paul and Caroline have other engagements, pressing engagements. So before we actually lose them from the discussion, I do want to fire off a quick question to both of you, and that's a question about strategy. Now we have all of us together, we have just come out of a very, very scarring, actually, years-long experience of campaigning. We had a hopeful narrative. We had, if you wish, we had truth on our side. We had personal stories. We had progressive arguments. Unfortunately, we did not prevail with that. So where do we? What's our strategy to basically reopen this chapter that for many people, they just wish it was closed? We know it's not closed. We know we're not experiencing even the beginning of it yet, actually. But what's our strategy in terms of building a movement now around a more progressive relationship, a closer relationship? Caroline, over to you first.
Okay, I'll just solve that, and then I'll leave.
Yeah,
no, it's a very good question. It's a very good question, and I guess I've just got a few ideas towards an answer, and some of it might be about showing rather than telling, and by that I mean we do know that a lot of businesses around the nations of the UK are really struggling now. And not just the bigger businesses who are the exporting, because quite a lot of small and medium-sized enterprise depend on those bigger businesses. They are suppliers to them and so forth. So even if they're not exporting directly themselves, they are impacted by this. And I think having a bit of a local and regional strategy around making sure a spotlight is shone on some of those stories, so that it's some of those businesses that people know and recognize and value in their communities, when they see them really suffering from this, then in a sense I think that means a lot more than having press releases sent out from a national office in London, let's say. So to the extent possible, re-energizing a kind of a regional network. And I think the work of the Spotlight website will be really vital, so that we've got a kind of a compendium of data and information about what is happening, but then trying to relate that more locally. So first of all, you begin to get more of a local awareness and understanding that actually there really is a major problem here. It's not teething problems, it's not just COVID, it's actually local businesses, people that I know, people who used to be employed and now aren't, as a direct result of this. So then we build up, I think, more of a kind of a constituency of people who are worried, and then they are more likely to be interested in some of the answers. And I think one of the advantages of the report, the way that Lucas set it out, is that in a sense there's a kind of a menu of options. You don't have to kind of swallow the whole lot at once. So we can suggest the proposals at the different times and in the different places where they're relevant. So there might be something, for example, about the UK-EU Veterinary Agreement that would have some benefit, I think, to some of the exporters to Northern Ireland. There are the ideas around the customs union. With young people, it'll be interesting to see how the government's programme to replace Erasmus actually works, but a lot of us are very sceptical about that. We don't think there's enough money in it. It's not truly reciprocal. So again, it might take a bit of time, but as people begin to say, hang on a minute, that wasn't what we thought it was going to be, and we don't have the funds to go to the other end of the world. You know, it's all very well saying, you know, the replacement is going to be this wonderful, this Turing scheme that's going to allow us to go to Australia or New Zealand. Well, most people can't afford to do that, and the travel costs aren't properly incorporated into the scheme. So that's just a long way around of saying that I think we have to go at the speed of people to recognize that there are problems in these various different areas, and then demonstrate where some of the solutions are, and then build that cumulative case. It feels that would be more effective than kind of what might appear to be a top-down, here's the solution type thing, which I just don't think right now is going to work.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and I think what you're saying is we're in this for the long haul.
I think so.
There's no quick fix. Paul, before you have to dash off as well, if you can impart some wisdom on us.
Well, whilst Carolyn's here, I'll probably take the advantage of it. First things first, we need to win the next general election. The left needs to win the next general election. And look, I'm very much on board with the idea that first past the post is a disaster for this country's democracy. I think Brexit has finally put the final nail in the coffin for first past the post as far as the left is concerned in this country. And we need to just grasp the nettle with it. And I'm all for having a non-aggression pact with the relevant left parties across the first past the post constituencies to ensure that we beat Conservatives in every possible constituency, to get a left majority in the House of Commons, to finally turn over the electoral system as a part of that coalition agreement, or that kind of electoral pact, if you like, and finally kill it off with single transferable vote, additional member system, whatever it might be, but just kill this bloody first past the post system. Which is artificially allowing Conservatives to basically rule this country without a popular mandate. That has to happen. In order for this agenda to proceed with political power, we can't do much without political power in this country, and that's a fundamental reality we need to confront. And that's why I'm so eager that the Labour Party adopts a formal policy on proportional representation, because it needs to be critical to how we move forward. That aside, I think we need to be braver and more confident in the arguments. I think the one thing that shocked me reflecting on the 2016 referendum was that this campaign to leave the EU had been going on for 30 years. You know, it was a sophisticated, extremely well resourced and insidious campaign that drilled away at the British people's sense of what the European Union was. And there was a lazy bureaucratic inertia about what the EU was from those who were generally supportive of it, or just kind of, it was there, did its thing. There was never really a great sort of enthusiasm for its utility for the British people. There was never that great evangelical argument about why we should be part of it or whatever. We never fought European election campaigns as part of the European parliamentary families. We just kind of fought them as Labour, Conservative or Green or Liberal Democrat. We never fought it as like S&D or whatever, and had that idea of a bigger European agenda. You know, it was always very parochial in how we approached the European Union. So I think that kind of was in a way sowing the seeds of its decay. And obviously we had the issue with enlargement, which then bred all that idea about mass migration and all the kind of xenophobic reactionary rhetoric around that. So we need to think about how we failed and understand why we failed, understand why people had legitimate grievances, legitimate democratic and economic reasons for wanting to leave the EU, however misguided we think they are, and I think they are, you know, to be quite frank. But we need to respect their position and meet them where they're at. And then, you know, and when people say, oh, the working class that voted Brexit, I think that is more nuanced than that. You know, young people didn't vote Brexit, young working class people didn't vote Brexit, BAME working class people didn't vote Brexit, working class women didn't vote Brexit. You know, so there's nuances in this discussion. But I think to an extent we can be a bit confident in that the truth's on our side, reasons on our side, demographics are on our side, younger people coming through all the time, you know, but I think we need to be confident in building that resilient, rational argument slowly and surely over time about why, for example, participation in the customs union makes sense, participation in Erasmus makes sense. You know, that we're never going to build our own Galileo GPS system in Britain alone because it's ridiculously expensive to do it alone, you know, so we have to be part of that collaboration we have to pool resources, we have to share resources, and for the benefit of our common good. That we have common reasons to work with our European partners in the interests of foreign affairs, justice across the world, and actually the bigger agenda of the climate emergency and how we approach that, with particularly around trade agreements around the world. And the fact is, we've pushed ourselves into an incredibly weak position internationally. And that's the supreme irony of the whole thing. So I think actually being a bit more confident about using the P word in terms of patriotism, because I think the left has a very uncomfortable relationship with the word patriotism. A lot of the working class in this country want to feel that they're patriotic. And we have to actually say that, you know, having a good and proud relationship with Europe, being influential in Europe, be a positive force in the world is the patriotic thing to do. It not just advances British interests, but it also advances British prosperity. And I think we have to have a more confident relationship with making that case.
Thank you very much.
Sorry,
Paul.
I need to run away. Is that all right?
Fantastic, both. I agreed with everything.
Yeah, we
and you endorsed the report, so it's a quid pro quo, if you will.
Okay, well, lovely to see you, and sorry to have to leave early, but I've got another thing at 7:30.
I need to dash off to a CLP meeting as well, if that's all right.
That's okay. We're going to continue the strategy discussion, actually. And so lovely to see both of you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for
thanks a lot. Keep us up to date with what's happening. Happy to come back and have another chat and everything. You know.
Definitely
Thank
will. You know we
Fantastic.
will.
Okay, thanks a lot.
And now we're going to continue talking about well, what we've just heard from our speakers, but also with some more details from Luke's report. But I wanted to make this as participatory as possible. And actually, I would really like to hear what people from the audience think about our strategy and what we should be doing right now, but also any questions you have of Luke specifically about the recommendations, the process of putting it together, how realistic some of these recommendations are in terms of the process of renegotiating the deal, and anything surrounding the report and what we've just heard, really. If you want, you can raise your hand and I'll give you the floor so you can ask your question. The raise hand button should be on the panel under your video, or you can use the Q&A function as well, where we have one question which I'm going to answer in a bit, but I'm first gonna unmute Peter. Hopefully this works. Hi, Peter.
Hello, hi. Can you hear me? How are you doing? Can you hear me? Sorry.
I can hear you, but quite faint. I
Yes,
don't
I
know if
apologize
Luke
for
can
that.
hear you.
Yeah.
Yep, it's fine.
I mean, it seems to me to be ironic that just at the time when the harms of Brexit are becoming obvious, the Labour Party, and to a lesser extent, the Lib Dems, are pretending it isn't happening. And you know, my wish would be to make it clear that it will be not to their electoral advantage to take that line. They actually need to cultivate their true supporters who are mostly pro-European. Why aren't they doing that? And what can we do to persuade them?
Great question.
Thanks.
So, thanks so much, Peter. I think you hit the nail on the head there. I would say that there are two aspects to it. Like the first aspect, which I mean, I think is a strangely difficult argument to make with leading Labour politicians and people in SW1, but you would think it would be obvious, and that is that Labour need to think about how they want to govern Britain. Like, what do they actually want to do with power? And that's the first thing. And once they've worked out what they actually want to do with power and how they would like to govern, and realize, I think, almost necessarily, if you're progressive and you want something akin to a progressive agenda, you've got to look again at this Brexit deal, because the content of it is really damaging to not just your voters, but to Brexit voters too. It's really, really damaging in lots of ways. So you're going to have, do you want to have a huge amount of difficult problems that you don't need, because you could get a better deal quite quickly with the EU, and then you can get on with the rest of your domestic agenda. That means that fundamentally the issue of Britain's relationship with the EU is an issue of how we want to govern Britain. So that's the first thing. I mean, the second thing is that unless Labour take a good position, I don't think they will win the next general election, because they have to shore up their progressive flank, and they have to make sure that the progressive electorate that's prepared to vote for them, maybe vote for them tactically in some places. It needs that tactical vote. You say, well, I'm not a Labour person, but I'm going to give them my vote because we need to get the Tories out. And I think it was really interesting to hear Paul Sweeney there really clearly lay out an agenda, not just for electoral reform, but also saying, well, look, we need non-aggression pacts at a local level to get the Tories out. And tomorrow you might have noticed, and it's going to be in the news, that Boris Johnson is going to be hosting Viktor Orban. And one of the things that we've been saying in Another Europe for a long time is that the struggle against authoritarian nationalism is a global struggle. And while there's a spectrum, we're not saying it's the same everywhere. We think that Brexit is an authoritarian and nationalistic project, and it's part of a bigger picture that's happening globally. Hungary gives a really worrying example of where we could end up if you just keep letting the genie go out of the bottle again and again and again and again, right? And it does give a really worrying sense of where we might get to. And what we must learn from the Hungarian opposition is that they said they're facing a very authoritarian government, and a government that's prepared to break the rules left, right, and centre in order to win and colonise the state, and has a first past the post electoral system. And Paul is absolutely right. If you're facing an authoritarian party that's prepared to do anything it takes to stay in power, the opposition have to unite, and that's what they've done in Hungary. They have an electoral alliance and says, look, democracy is more important than our differences. So I think that that's what's at stake in a way, and I think it's very interesting to hear Paul say that. Look, was until recently, I think, quite an unpopular argument, the case for electoral alliances in the Labour Party. I think it's potentially changing. Definitely on electoral reform, Labour is in a completely different place to where it was 5 years ago. So I think the Another Europe milieu and supporters and members can play a really important strategic role here, precisely because we take from all parts of the progressive part of politics.
Great. And while we wait for some other questions, Luke, I wanted to ask you something about one of the areas that you outline as problematic of the deal, which is precisely around the idea of sovereignty and agency that both Paul and Caroline touched upon. Now, clearly, the deal delivers nothing of the sort. In fact, it multiplies the agencies and various external bodies that regulate a number of aspects of trading relationship and therefore standards and else. But how do we use that idea? How do we use that idea, which clearly has a lot of potency and a lot of traction with the general public, to try and rebuild a momentum around this campaign? What's our version of sovereignty?
Yeah, well, I think in a way the trade deals are the key to the whole picture, really, because I think our progressive critique of trade deals involves a different conception of sovereignty. So the Conservatives have a conception of sovereignty which is basically, well, we want as much national sovereignty as possible, but we are in an undisclosed way, in effect, prepared to cede a hell of a lot of sovereignty to other states globally, and also to big multinational capital as much as possible. And if you look at some of the details of the agreement, I think I mentioned Australia. Australia's also packaged up with the Trans-Pacific Partnership that Australia is a member of, and groups together a number of countries in Asia. Trump didn't sign the US up to it. It doesn't look like, and well, Biden is not going to sign the US up to it. So it's mainly Asian nations. It's quite a traditional trade agreement, very in the neoliberal sense, very free market, involves things like corporate courts. But agriculture has been a really important issue in the public debate, as I said. But another, I think, just as important and less widely discussed is steel. And steel is currently protected behind European protective tariffs as a result of the trade and cooperation agreement. And potentially our steel industry could come under huge pressure from lower cost Asian producers. And I think the parallel with agriculture and what's interesting about them is that they're tiny fractions of GDP. I think steel is 0.1% of GDP. I think agriculture is 0.5, 0.6 or something like that. So they're really small fraction of the economy. And that's why when you read the government's own figures on what the Australian deal will do for the UK economy, it will say, I think they anticipate a mere 500 million in GDP over 15 years. So you're talking like absolutely nothing. So then that leaves the question, well, why does it matter? I mean, are we just making a fuss about nothing? But the specific impacts on sectors can be really big. And those are people, especially in the steel industry, I think it's a romantic sector, and it's crucial to our national economy because we need a steel industry, we need it for our train lines, etc., and so on. So even though it's a small fraction of our service-dominated economy, agriculture puts 55% of food on our shelves that we still. Yes, we import some, but we're still a big food producing nation. We're still a steel maker. So I think on those sector specific sides, the Brexit coalition can particularly be broken up. Elena, are you breaking up?
Oh God, finally, it's working. Sorry about that.
Right, okay, yeah, so you went away for a second.
My screen froze and then I couldn't unmute myself. It's everyone's nightmare on Zoom, but come on, it's been a year and a half. We've seen it all by now. I have a question from Michal. Michal, I'm going to let you speak now, hopefully.
Yeah, thank you very much. Basically, my question is, well, I suppose my question is twofold. One, the main one is, what can we do to protect the rights of EU citizens? I suppose one key issue here is the image that EU citizens have in the media and the image that is projected by the right-wing media in the UK, especially English media. Interestingly, obviously, Scottish media is slightly different, and I think the ownership structure is also slightly different. And the other question is, well, can we kind of negotiate our way back to Europe, but not necessarily to the European Union straight away? That what I mean by that is, negotiating our way back into. We've mentioned Erasmus. We've mentioned things like Galileo and other European projects and programs, European Union projects and programs. And if we start doing that, what will the right-wing press do? Because I think the reaction might be, are they going to realize what's being done here? And is there, a chance that we will divide them, or is it basically is there a risk that we'll create a unified front against the kind of pro-European policies that we want to advocate? So basically, it's two questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Michal. A little bit on the European nationals. I'm actually gonna take that one myself. Is I mean, it's now less than 5 weeks until the deadline for European nationals who already live in the UK to legalize their status, to obtain the newly designed settled status by the Home Office. And we are already starting to see all the horror stories, as Caroline mentioned, and several people have mentioned already. The treatment of European nationals is already changing. And I think what's remarkable is when you see the responses from Priti Patel and Boris Johnson, especially on recent articles and recent developments, they're basically not answering. They're not answering the question at hand, because they know that they have the power to legislate for this all to go away, for this to not be a problem, but that they're not willing to do that. So I think we need to be much bolder and kind of much more ambitious in building a coalition, because there is a good tradition of campaigning on migrants' rights in the UK. I don't think that the sector as a whole has woken up to the reality of what is going to happen with European nationals as well. Just the sheer scale of it that we're going to be facing. We have a campaign to demand the automatic right to stay for European nationals living in the UK, which is what we were all promised. Let's not forget. So I'm gonna post some more details about that in the chat. But we're running out of time on this, and we need much bigger organizing and many more allies to jump on this and make this a priority topic, actually. And then on the right-wing press, I think that's quite an interesting question. Look, when you were writing your kind of steps and recommendations about specific areas, did you consider this? What would the response be from the right if we tried to gain these little concessions and these little steps bringing us closer to Europe?
Well, I think there's clearly quite a few people who won't like the proposals that we've outlined here, particularly when it comes to the more SW1 political Brexiteers, the Vote Leave coalition, Nigel Farage, Aaron Banks, individuals like that. They're not gonna support the proposals that we outline, and clearly those people do have a prominent voice in large parts of the pro-Brexit media, it's fair to say. Where I think that there are some avenues that can be made is, I think, as Caroline said earlier, you can kind of break up the deal into and the campaigning strategy into kind of an a la carte menu of options. And there are definitely some areas, food standards, environmental standards, where we will find surprising allies who aren't actually committed to the most hardline possible Brexit, including in the right-wing media. In fact, you've already seen that with the Daily Mail and the neoliberal trade deals agenda. And I don't think it's the Daily Mail suddenly becoming a benign organisation. I think they're reflecting some of the issues that are important to their readership. And yeah, I agree. The National Farmers Union has been very vocal against these agreements too. The other side, I would say, on EU nationals, and the thing that I've been thinking about recently, it's also a point that comes up in the Brexit Land book that some people on the call might have read, a recent book by a couple of British politics academics that goes through the long-term development of the kind of political values and ideas that led us to Brexit in 2016, 2020. And one of the points that they make in this book, and contrast with EU citizens, is that because of the nature of post-war immigration into the UK, that tended to come initially from Commonwealth countries. And as a result of the inclusive peculiarities of our electoral franchise, those new groups who suffered terrible racism when they arrived. I mean, obviously we shouldn't, play down anything of any of the racism that they encountered on British streets and in the media and in wider society. They nonetheless had a very clear political voice from day one. They could vote, and you haven't had that with EU nationals. And indeed, if EU nationals had a vote in the 2016 referendum, Brexit almost certainly wouldn't have happened, and our politics would be very different. And I think you see cultural effects of this too. Recently the BBC had I think it was called The World at War. It was an Anglo-Polish drama series. It's not necessarily a recommendation. It's about the Second World War. It's an okay drama. It's not amazing. But what's striking about it is it's probably the first time that this huge community in the UK had anything like approaching cultural representation in British culture. And I was reading a recent excellent blog by Jonathan Portes, where he also points out that there are probably 1 million Romanians living in the UK. And again, we don't hear about the Romanian community. So I think one important thing that we should do around this Brexit spotlight aspect is make sure that we, as far as possible, are building links and giving voice to the EU citizens that have taken out settled status, and incorporating them as much as we can into our politics and into our society to make sure their voice is really heard.
Luke, I think oh no, it's fine.
Oh, sorry. I was going to, there was, sorry that we didn't get to take Sarah's question.
Yeah, I think Sarah wanted to clarify some of the points about collaboration between campaigns, and I think she put it quite nicely. That it's going back to the days of the referendum, and since then, we all have our specific insights and our specific angles, but we all like ice cream. we know what unites us, and I think we need that kind of diverse approach to be able to spread the message as wide as possible, whatever we think our priorities are, and definitely not collaborated with the European movement or grassroots for Europe. Something that so that's now been discussed by Richard and Sarah. I think Rowena makes a really good point as well in the Q&A box, which is that still to this day, a lot of people kind of associate freedom of movement with a certain decline in job prospects, in the quality of jobs, and the organizing power and the labor movement power for UK workers. And actually the two things are they're related, but they're not it's not a cause and effect relationship. It's not because of freedom of movement that working conditions have declined for UK workers. It's because of the decline of conditions for UK workers and the ability to seek a lower paid workforce that we're having the impact now, and that we're discussing Brexit now. But I think it also points to something else that Luke was saying. How do we make the positive steps to include the migrant workforce into our political processes? They are called sectors, and they usually coincide. The sectors that traditional trade unions view as difficult to organize are usually sectors in which migrant workers are overrepresented, and there are sectors where exploitation is rife, and there are sectors that urgently need all of the support that the labor movement can offer, because workers do organize for themselves. It's just that they do it maybe outside of the traditional structures of trade unions. So that is, that's a process that's happening, whether our trade unions want to get involved or not. It's a matter of what they would gain and what we would all gain as a labor movement if we united those struggles and if we were more connected with the issues that migrant workers face. And I hope people will have seen or will have time to check out the recordings from our sessions that we did with European alternatives on some of the most kind of precarious sectors, not just in the UK, but in Europe as a whole. We had a session about delivery workers and how they organize in the UK, but also in Germany. And yesterday we had a really interesting discussion about care workers as well. And these struggles are related, but these are also ways in which we can start building these connections that we're talking about that will help us foster or repair the close relationships with Europe, because we still have a very mobile workforce, we still have common challenges, and we still have common solutions as well. Sorry, I'm looking to see if I've missed a question or it's been mostly.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you put the interaction between freedom of movement and the question, as the person who asked the question put it, Rowena put it exactly right as well, that obviously we've lived through neoliberalism and we've lived through a freedom of movement citizen rights system that has now ended. We've lived through both of those things, and political scientists like me have massive debates over, well, what was the cause? Was it neoliberalism or was it the other one? But I think we need to be clear that giving people citizen rights is actually a way to tackle neoliberalism and to fight neoliberalism. If you have strong workers' rights, if you have strong citizen rights, if you have security of status to live in the UK, you are much less vulnerable to super exploitation. And another thing that we say in the report that I think it's worth mentioning is that the government have created a slightly more liberal and a slightly more open system for the visa system, which used to be for non-EU immigrants, but is now, of course, one universal system. Now, that's a much worse system if you're an EU national. If you're not an EU national and if you're from the rest of the world, it's a slightly better system. The income threshold has come down. The graduate visa is back. You can stay a bit after your degree. It's not quite as restrictive and closed as the Theresa May system, if you like. So it's really important for us going forward that, yes, we want a free movement relationship with Europe, but we don't want to hurt and make more restrictive as an exchange, if you like, the visa system for non-EU migrants. We don't want to level down, we want to level up. And obviously that's something that Another Europe has always been really, really clear on. But as the detail of this gets worked out over the next years, over the next 5 years, and different proposals come forward for manifestos and so on, we need to maintain that really clear no levelling down argument.
Well, look, if I can ask you a kind of a more, I guess, a more practical question. In the here and now, in this particular moment, where would you start from? What's our low-hanging fruit from, if any of them are low-hanging from the report? What's our easiest win?
Yeah, well, I won't repeat myself because I've gone on about the non-EU trade deals already. I think there are wins there. The other thing that we haven't discussed, but we do talk about in the report a lot, is of course the situation facing Northern Ireland. Caroline mentioned it earlier. The easiest thing you can do to fix the real and genuine problems that will now exist for the supply of food to the north of Ireland is to harmonise UK food standards with EU food standards, and that would be what the EU has offered it as part of the negotiation. It would be a Swiss arrangement. It's what Switzerland does. There are no food standards checks on food coming into, and veterinary standards checks on food or animal products or animals coming in to Switzerland from the EU, and vice versa. They're fully harmonized. Now, the government doesn't want to do that because they know that they want to sign these trade deals and they can't decide what position they want to fall down on. And it's a really peculiar case of ideology trumping pragmatics. So an agriculture agreement with Australia and farming food standards agreement with Australia would not lead to massive exports from the UK to Australia. Australia's industry and industrial farming is more competitive than the UK. So the UK can only lose from that arrangement. Meanwhile, the UK has this huge problem in Northern Ireland where harmonizing food would make a huge practical difference to the UK government. So it's a real case of Brexit leading a government governing the UK as a whole to act really quite irrationally. Ideology trumps basic policy. If they didn't want to harmonize food standards, they could still make a huge difference to Northern Ireland by what's sometimes called the New Zealand option. New Zealand is regulatory alignment with the EU agreeing to uphold EU rules and standards, something short of full harmonization. And that would eliminate, I think it's like 99% of checks. So again, that would really solve a lot of the difficulties that are being encountered in Northern Ireland. So we must, I think, just as a campaign in general, talk about what's going on in Northern Ireland more. It's obviously we're very pro the peace process. We don't want to see any return of any violence in Northern Ireland. On the Brexit Spotlight website, we have a really good explainer and interview at the academic Katie Hayward, who works with UK in a Changing Europe and a friend of the Another Europe campaign. We have quite a few good civil society contacts in the north of Ireland and political contacts in the north of Ireland too, who are doing work on these issues. I think just as a predominantly Great Britain, England, Scotland, Wales based campaign, we just need to make sure we maintain those lines of communications, because if there's a crucible where Brexit is really unraveling, it's definitely in the north of Ireland. Doesn't mean that it will unravel the whole of the Brexit process. If we've learned anything, well, it won't. Just to say that it's not going to unravel the whole of the Brexit process. If we've learned anything from the Brexit negotiations, a messy compromise that satisfies no one is always possible. Maybe that David Frost will negotiate some kind of food standards agreement that isn't quite harmonization, but does come close, or you can imagine the outline of a compromise happening. And it's also possible in the future, potentially, that Northern Ireland might benefit from its very, very peculiar, exceptional, unique status as both in the European single market, part of its freedom of movement system, able to export freely to the European market, and then also at the same time in the UK customs territory. So a lot of the high profile Brexit spotlight style issues that have come up, wine exporters on Twitter that I bet a lot of people on the call have been following and things. I mean, the interesting of importers to the UK, the interesting thing about the Brexit agreement is that Northern Ireland gives them a really simple solution. So all they need to do, and I know this is a bit not quite an all they need to do, it's quite a technically difficult thing, but they just need to set up a distribution centre in the north of Ireland. So they route all of their European imports through the UK into Great Britain via Northern Ireland, and they would reduce a lot of the trade barriers that they are having a lot of difficulty with now because of Northern Ireland's special status. So it's a very peculiar situation that North of Ireland is in economically, but it's one that we really have to keep an eye on from this pro-peace, pro-social justice perspective.
And Michal has just asked another very good question. Will a potential Scotland-England hard border push England, the UK back towards the EU, or would it have the opposite effect?
Great question. So I think an England, well, you know, I should say that in terms of another Europe's policy, we don't say much more than we just support the right of Scottish self-determination. So I'm just speaking for myself here. We have supporters in the SNP and Labour in Scotland and all sorts. So, but I think the hard border between Scotland and England is one of the really interesting, knotty problems that the independent case will face. And you know, obviously, you would hope that Britain rejoins the single market, England and Wales, or the UK government, however it looks, in 5 years or so, rejoins the single market, rejoins free movement, has a close relationship with Europe. That would make Scottish independence a much easier practical prospect. It would still face major difficulties. They'd have to sort out what they were doing with the currency, decide whether they were going to join the euro or not. It would still be very difficult. But it would be, but you would deal with the border with England question. I mean, the border between England and Scotland is geographically not quite as difficult as the border between the north and south of Ireland. I think there are over 300 entry and exit points between the north and south of Ireland. I think there's less than 10% of that between England and Scotland. The number of roads are much reduced, but still, I think for people whose economic livelihoods are based in that border region, the introduction of a border would be really, really difficult, just like it would be in Ireland. Of course, it doesn't come with the historical problems, peace process, any issues like that in terms of England-Scotland relationship. But it would be tough, and it will be interesting to see how it plays out. You know, I think we have learned that referenda maybe aren't great ways of resolving constitutional issues. I think if you broke down Brexit in 2016 into 50 individual questions, I think another Europe, like, do you want citizen mutual rights agreement so that we can work in Europe and Europeans can work in here? When you pose freedom of movement in those terms, our side always wins. Do you want high food standards? We'd win. Do you want protection of the steel industry? We'd win. On the content, we always, in public opinion, we nearly always win if it's framed the right way. On the big constitutional issue where it becomes either you're all for this proposition or you're all against it, I think it becomes much harder. So I hope if Scotland's going to have, as it now will do, this this independence campaign and this huge independence debate, I hope that it can have as much deliberative, participatory elements as possible, a citizens' assembly, as much dialogue with England and English regions about the border, so that there's just so people are as well informed as possible when they come to make the decision.
Indeed, and I think there's some good kind of insights and lessons for us in what you said that there towards the end about you know, the bits where we always win and the bits where we stumble a bit. So it's a matter of us being able to frame the question really, rather than follow and answer someone else's question. So we just need to set the questions ourselves. And I see a hand from Hillary, which is probably the last question we're going to take. Hillary, you should be able to speak now.
Hello, is that me?
It is.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello. A very interesting discussion. How are we as a country taking back control when many of our industries and assets, the water industry, the electricity, the gas industry, the power industries are foreign owned? And how can we sort of counteract the right-wing media?
Thanks, Hillary. Well, indeed, the great take back control line was was all but an illusion. In fact, the whole plan for Brexit is to make sure that there is even easier way in for international capital into the industries of interest for them. But again, I think this is a really interesting question, because we know that actually this goes against what the public wants. So this model of running services based on the interests of international capital is precisely what the public does not want. And we know that nationalization or bringing industries back into public control are incredibly popular. They always are. They always trump various polls, various election campaigns. It's always the case that's what the public wants. It's just a matter of how it's presented to them and what's it packaged in. And
yeah, I mean, I think if there were some Tories on this panel, we don't talk to Tories very much, but there are certainly some Tories who would turn around now and say they agree with you. Like a good example would be, and don't get me wrong, I think we should call out their hypocrisy here, but a good example would be Ben Hoochan, the T Valley mayor, who won a landslide in the recent mayoral election. Is hugely popular, but one of the main reasons he's popular is he's brought the airport into public ownership. And the sad thing about the Labour Party in that region is that they would never had the confidence to come out and say, hey, we need to have a publicly run airport. It took a Tory to say that. So I think for the most part, the new Toryism is the state investment strategy, it's at best smoke and mirrors. It's at worst quite crony capitalism. But I think the debate going forward and you're right to touch on this completely, Hillary, will not be investment versus austerity. It will be public ownership versus massive state subsidies for the private sector. So, we should be, there's really good campaign, We Own It, trade union backed campaign that's putting forward these arguments, also doing really good campaigning on trade as well and how that interacts with these issues. So yeah, we absolutely need to go on the offensive here, because this is precisely an area where public opinion is completely on our side. I mean, look at the terrible record that the water companies have on river pollution, an area where the UK was always losing these European court cases because we were in breach of European clean water standards. We can combine the pro-regulation argument. We want the new Environmental Protection Agency to actually protect our environment at least as well, if not better, as the EU, with a public ownership argument here, because of course all these water companies, lots of them, as you say, are foreign owned and all making tidy profits, and have made a lot of profits every year since they were privatized in the 1990s. So this is something where it's not in the consumer interest, it's not in the state's interest. So we're on the winning side of this argument. How do we just need to be better at securing victory rather than just being on the right side of public opinion?
Indeed. Well, that's wrap up, I think, for us for this evening. Thank you very much, Luke, for all your work.
Thanks, everyone.
On the report. Thanks, everyone, for the good questions and insightful remarks. I've posted the link to the report once again. Feel free to share it with any like-minded people, and indeed with not like-minded people. And we will be publishing the recording of this meeting on our YouTube channel in the next coming days. Hopefully you are already on our mailing list, but if you're not, you can just go on the website and sign up. You can also join us to support our work as a member, and then you'll get to vote in elections and determine our strategy. And finally, we did talk a lot about the rights of European nationals. Make sure you follow our Right to Stay campaign, which is entering the most crucial time, the last month, where we can make some change happen for the rights of European nationals. But we're not going to give up even beyond the deadline. Thanks once again. Have a lovely evening, and we'll see you soon, I'm sure. Bye.